Not yet. Okay, let
Not
me
yet.
put the thing.
Okay, thank you. All right, it's 9 o'clock. Let's go ahead and have a prayer and we'll get started today. God, thank you so much for this day and for every blessing that you bestow upon us. We have so much to be thankful for on a regular basis, and so often we forget to say thank you. Be with us today as we take some time to study your word, as we approach you thereafter in worship to you, and help us to live faithfully in our daily lives. We love you so much. I pray for everyone in this room, all the families that are represented here, and pray you would bless them. And God, thank you so much for always being the God of all comfort to those that are suffering, those that are struggling, and help us to do everything that we can to be comforts for them as well. We love you so much. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right, so today is the Levitical and priestly duties, the second part of Israelite worship. Forgive me, I'm not feeling super well, so if I'm sort of going really slow, forgive me, but we'll try and go through as much of this as we can today. There's a chance we may not get through it all, but I'll try here. And this is a relevant discussion point for us because we can kind of assume that all the Israelites were commanded to take part in worship duties and to offer sacrifices and things like that. And to a certain extent, that's true, but to another extent, it's not at all. There are some specific duties that were given to the Levites specifically. And we'll talk about who they were, what exactly their duties were, and how that reflects upon us for when the New Testament, for example, says that we're a priesthood. Right? We'll take some time discussing all those things. So I want to start with this here. Who were the Levites exactly? Genealogies are hard, so I tried to just put this in a list. So the Levitical lineage is kind of like this. You have Levi, who's the third son of Jacob by Rachel. And you may remember from there, Rachel says like, well, now... Actually, no, forgive me. I have the wrong name up here. But it said that like now my husband will be joined to me because I've given him this third son, right? And so this was considered a big deal in Leah's mind. And so Levi is sort of the name for that. You have Kohath. He's the second son of Levi. So again, we have Jacob, Levi, Kohath. And of course, pay attention to the fact that when we're talking about Levi, for example, he's the third son of Jacob. So there are other children, of course, that he had, but they did not fall into this Levitical lineage that we're talking about right now. But there's Kohath. Then you have Amram, who's the first son of Kohath. So again, Levi, Kohath, Amram, right? And then you have Aaron. And this is where maybe it gets a little more familiar to us. He's the first son of Amram. Even in Exodus 4:14, when God says, "Is there not your brother Aaron the Levite?" And so it's explicitly said that Aaron is related to, is a Levite himself, and it's eventually he and his male descendants that are given these duties of the priesthood. And for those Levites that are not part of the priesthood, they were at the very least assisting the priest. And so there are some specific things that they were supposed to do that none of the other Israelites were supposed to do. You take, for example, actually, I'll move on to that later. So let's say this. One thing to bear in mind is that only these individuals were Israelite priests. Only them, as far as it seems to be. There's some debate as to the how do I say, vocabulary-wise. In what cases are the word priest and Levite considered the same, speaking about the same thing in the Old Testament? And that has to be figured out on a case-by-case basis. But Exodus 40:15, and as well as several other passages, do draw a distinction between Aaron and his male descendants along with other Levites. And so just because they were, really the way I've seen it said was like all priests were Levites, but not all Levites were priests, right? So that's a really important thing to bear in mind. And then as we've already mentioned, other Levites, they just helped the priest. They were tasked with and we'll talk about this in more detail, but like protecting the sanctuary as the priests are doing their work, and so that's it's important for us to see that. The Levites, again, these are, through this lineage, you have Aaron and his male descendants that are given this priestly role, and you have other Levites that perhaps don't do that exactly, but you do find these special privileges that are given to the Levites. One thing that I've seen before, and I'm not terribly sure about exactly how correct this is, but it's a fair point. It's been argued by many that God has the system of the Levites because after Moses comes down from the mountain and Aaron has gone in with everyone and made the golden calf, it's basically well, I had plans to make all of you priests, but clearly I can't do that, so I'm going to make this just the Levites instead. I think that's possibly true. To my knowledge, it's not, that connection is not explicitly made. You kind of figure out pieces as you go along, but it's not necessarily the same. One thing also to bear in mind with this, I've put up before on the screen this rough timeline of covenants and systems like that. When you have in Genesis, for example, Melchizedek, right? I don't know who he was, but what I know is that he was a priest of the Most High God, right? And that poses some questions for us because, Melchizedek's not a Levite. Well, if you're bearing a proper understanding of the timeline in mind, he didn't have to be a Levite. God could issue anyone to be a priest before the old law comes into being. And certainly he still could do whatever he wants, but he chose in the Mosaic law and the law of Moses to make it just the sons of Levi that have this task. So take even when you go to Hebrews 7, one of the ways that argument is made about Jesus is that basically Melchizedek has to be outside of the old covenant because he doesn't have a written genealogy or any lineage to sort of support his being a priest. So that must be a sign of a different covenant than what you find under Moses. And so Jesus, later on down the road, is also a priest, but he's not from the tribe of Levi. And so one of the ways that it's argued in Hebrews 7 is that Melchizedek and Jesus both must be outside of the old law because they aren't Levites. So when you see a change in the priesthood, and this is its point in Hebrews, when you see a change in the priesthood, not just relying on a single lineage, what you have there is a sign that you're dealing with a different covenant system there. Even one of the things that you find, especially with the northern, really the northern and southern kingdoms, you see this some, but at many points there are non-Levitical priests that are appointed, which is a massive downplaying of God's authority because God didn't allow that, right? And so you find even that split in the kingdom produces some irreverent things and thought processes about who the priests were supposed to be because they didn't properly obey what God wanted them to do with the Levites there. Any questions on this before I move on? Okay. All right, so we're going to divide this up into priestly Levitical duties and then non-priestly Levitical duties. In other words, what did the Levites who were priests do? And then what did the Levites who were not priests but were assisting the priest, what did they do? One thing to bear in mind too is that in some text, the distinction is not entirely clear. Right? There are some texts where you kind of get this sense that both the priestly and non-priestly Levites are responsible for something. And so I'm trying to dichotomize this a little bit, to distinguish these a little bit, but that's not necessarily, I tried to make this as specific as possible, but you could find text where some of these things are, the priests are doing this thing and taking the lead on this thing, but the non-priestly Levites are helping with this thing. So at what point do you consider that playing a part in something versus just helping, right? It's a complicated discussion in a way. one of the things that the priests did was that they would minister in the sanctuary. So you find in Numbers 18 and verse 1, you find that the sons of Aaron were supposed to take a special religious, spiritual charge in the sanctuary. It was an incredibly important thing for them to do. You also have, and this part is just more going through Leviticus, because there's a lot given in Leviticus about what they were supposed to do. The priestly Levites, they would carry out the offerings. Now, you would still have an Israelite individual who would sort of kickstart it and, I'm not sure if I've done something wrong, but I just feel like something's off. I'm going to go offer a guilt offering. And then you'd have the Levites who would, splatter the blood or something like that, light the sacrifice on fire, those types of things. So you would have them not giving the offerings for people necessarily, apart from the Day of Atonement, which we'll get to. But you do have clear example of, in the first 7 chapters of Leviticus, a lot of this was on them to do. Pronouncing cleanness and uncleanness. There are a lot of different topics that are discussed in Leviticus 11 through 15. There are sexual issues, for example. There are just general cleanliness issues. There are all types of things that come up. But one of the jobs of the Levites was to pronounce individuals and even, animals for offerings and things like that as clean or unclean. And so they would kind of be some of the main ones to sort of distinguish between those. The Day of Atonement. I want to spend a little bit of time on this because something that you find that's interesting in Leviticus 16 is that this seems to be a job that is only given to Aaron. This doesn't seem to be a thing that all of the priests are doing. It's just him as, more or less the high priest. One thing about the Day of Atonement is this is the one day where the priest can enter into the most holy place, right? I should have put this on the screen. There's a chart from a Leviticus commentary that talks about, you have the tabernacle set up, and the author theorizes that different sins negatively affect different parts of the tabernacle. But only on the Day of Atonement can the most holy place be cleansed. And so the priest has to walk in there and make sure that the most holy place is taken care of. One thing that we'll talk about a little bit later on, you'll have texts in Hebrews, for example, that talk about how I'm paraphrasing and synthesizing a lot here, but sorry, my brain's running slow. You'll have that, there was no real forgiveness of sins when you get to the Old Covenant. And what I mean by that is just when you look at this entire idea of the Day of Atonement, it's just this, a lot of it is this term that roughly means to cover. So you don't necessarily have full forgiveness of sins, you just have them being covered for another year. If that sounds crazy, sure, but that's what the text says, is that you don't really have just, Jesus coming, dying on the cross, this once-for-all death and sacrifice on our behalf for our sins, and then everyone's good. You just don't get that picture in the Old Testament. You even had the priests themselves had to, of course, offer sacrifices. But the Day of Atonement really is sort of this, especially this sign that you don't really have just you're forgiven of this thing and it's just gone. That's why when you have in Jeremiah, for instance, when it says, I will remember their sins no more, and passages like that when talking about the Old Covenant, is because even with the old law, you find the blood of bulls and goats cannot take away sins. Part of this is recognizing as well how powerful the new covenant is by comparison to the old covenant, because the old covenant is it's obviously a covenant system with God, and I think sometimes maybe we can disrespect the old covenant a little bit, because we're kind of sitting there and saying well, when the text says that the old covenant wasn't perfect, that means it must have been a horrible covenant or something. No, be careful. That's still God's word, and that's still a covenant system given from God, so don't be irreverent about that. But the Bible does nonetheless still call the new covenant better. Based on better promises, based on better and more full forgiveness, all of these things make the new covenant better than the old. And so that's important to pay attention to. I'll put both of these on the screen here. Promoting and practicing holiness, right? Maybe promoting is too soft of a word, but I honestly just kind of wanted the PR sound for both of those. But what you have in Leviticus 17 through 20 is you have a lot of these laws that are meant to basically say, like, Levites, you enforce this. Priest, you enforce this. One of the duties that all Levites had, priestly or non-priestly, was to teach the law. And we'll talk about that in a little bit, but they were supposed to do things that would promote holiness among the Israelite people. This is something that maybe we don't tend to think about a whole lot because it's uncomfortable and because sometimes we can be so individualistic when it comes to our faith that we just think, oh, well, it doesn't really matter what everyone else is doing as long as I'm walking in the right path. Well, if you have a text like 1 Corinthians 11 that seems to indicate that you are supposed to pay careful attention to those around you and really be careful about with whom are you partaking the Lord's Supper, right? It's, there's all types of things now about, table theology that everyone should be welcome to the Lord's Supper, no matter who they are, no matter what they believe, and that's just not biblical. And I mention this because we think that this whole idea of holiness in the whole camp is something that only mattered in the Old Testament. It's not. You find this being a shadow of what the new covenant still proceeds to say about the need for people to be holy, the need for people to care about the holy things of God. But then you also have they were supposed to practice holiness as well. Now, please don't take my putting this up here as to indicate that no one else had to be holy, just the priest had to be holy. No, it's given to everyone, be holy as I am holy, right? So it's like, please don't misread this, but the point here is the Levitical priests were supposed to be holy people and were supposed to be examples for the rest of the Israelite people. This wasn't just that they, give their offerings, give their sacrifices, and everything's all good. There are many points in Leviticus where it talks about if a Levite, right, if a Levitical priest is coming and he has this sin in his life, if he's not living in a way that's pure before God, that he shouldn't be serving in that particular circumstance. That's just not a thing. With the, and we'll talk about this more later, but with the Nadab and Abihu story, one of the points to take away from that, even though it's dangerous sometimes to make a paradigm out of a single event, but what you still find in there that God clearly seems to care about are his priests being holy. And when you're going to get wasted before offering a sacrifice, that's not a good thing, and that does not show reverence to God. So we want to pay attention to that. They were supposed to practice holiness as well. And then they were the ones primarily in charge of officiating a lot of the holy feast. And so that's something to pay attention to as well, that was primarily their job here. The last 4 chapters of Leviticus, you can't really, at least in my mind, you can't really outline it in the exact same way and give a full completion of the book, but it is pretty stunning that most of the book of Leviticus has a lot to say about what the Levitical priests were supposed to do. So pay careful attention to that. Any questions? Okay. The non-priestly Levitical duties then. The non-priestly Levitical duties. I'm sure I could have phrased this in a more condensed way, but this is what I was able to have. So you have in Numbers 4, they were in charge of transporting the sanctuary. I don't know if it's you, but when I was a kid, at least, I would sort of look at this and think like, oh man, mind you, I'm like 7, but like I'm sitting there thinking like, oh man, they must have been really strong. They just carried that entire building by themselves over to where they were going next. That's not necessarily what's going on. It's more they're taking the materials from the sanctuary and they're moving them as the Israelites travel, right? They were in charge of making sure that all the materials for the sanctuary were taken care of. And this is big, that they were supposed to assist the priest. They were to assist the priest. If you have these other Levites that are not male descendants of Aaron specifically, right? And they were supposed to make sure, basically, that everything went swimmingly for the Levitical priest. And so even though you have two very different roles, or sets of roles for them, you still nonetheless have this partnership that exists between the Levites. That's very important to pay attention to. They were also supposed to be gatekeepers of the sanctuary. Now, this is kind of sort of related to something that we'll see on the next slide about Numbers 18, that all Levites were supposed to guard the sanctuary. The exact distinction is hard to delineate, but gatekeeping and guarding, as weird as it sounds, it's concerning, as far as I'm aware, two kind of distinct things. And so they were supposed to mainly make sure that no outsiders were able to come in. And I think there's reason to believe that in Leviticus especially, and in Numbers, that when it's talking about foreign or strange, or just foreign individuals is how it names it. Same term actually for the unauthorized fire, by the way. But when they're supposed to be gatekeepers of the sanctuary, it's making sure that the people that are Levitical priests, that they're able to come in, and everyone else, you stay out. And in many cases, it said, if someone walks in that's not supposed to, you put them to death. Why would that matter? Well, primarily, God made a system of how things were supposed to work, and they were expected to keep it. So pay careful attention to that. And then they also had authority over storehouses and treasuries. This is kind of related to the first point that we'll talk about on the next slide. But they were the ones kind of in charge of like the possessions of the Israelites, and especially like things of monetary value, and to make sure that all those things were accounted for. So those are the non-priestly Levitical duties. There are probably more that you could list. I should have mentioned that neither of these are like meant to be comprehensive, because there's so much that you could list. And when we go to the duties of all Levites, we'll see there's a lot of overlap there. So any questions or thoughts on that? Okay. So these are the duties of all Levites. These are things that no matter whether they were priests or other Levites that were not sons, that were not direct offspring of Aaron, these are things that all Levites were in some way responsible for doing, right? So look, for example, in Deuteronomy 33 and verse 10. I'll actually ask you to turn there if you don't mind. Deuteronomy 33 and verse 10. One of the things that's important about this, and again, we want to be careful. It's not saying that the other Israelites were not supposed to be faithful. Like, please bear that in mind. But you don't really have, for example, in the Old Covenant, you don't have really like principles for evangelism in the Old Covenant. You just don't. You don't really have an equivalent of the Great Commission in the Old Covenant. But what you do have is this command that the people of Israel be kept and maintained as pure. Look in verse 10 with me, and I will read this. The Levites, they shall teach Jacob your rules and Israel your law. They shall put incense before you and whole burnt offerings on your altar, the ESV says. So a lot of this that's said to the tribe of Levi here is especially talking about them practicing that duty of everyone teaching the law, everyone playing a part in that. So just That's an important point to make here as well. They were also meant to be judges in disputes. When you and don't think of this necessarily in the same way as like judges from the book of Judges, right? What the judges were supposed to do, in that book, even though you have a lot of them that are incredibly flawed, like say Jephthah, who kills his daughter, or you have Solomon, who makes some or Samson, who makes some mistakes of his own, right? That's not exactly the same thing, because when you're looking at the judges there, it's talking about people who were just able to play some part in rescuing Israel at a particular time. It doesn't say anything about how good of people they were or something like that. It's just talking about they were there for a need and they fulfilled the need, right? Here, though, even though it's the same verb that's used, it's talking about judging between individuals, especially in their legal disputes and disputes of all other related kinds. And so if people had a dispute, you would go to some of the Levites. And again, I find this interesting that it's not just the Levitical priest, but it's all Levites that this responsibility is given to. We mentioned this already. Spoilers. You have guarding the sanctuary. Like I said, the exact distinction between this and being gatekeepers of the sanctuary can be a little unclear. But like we said, this is like the priests are in the tabernacle. They're doing their thing. You have the non-Levitical priests who are standing on the outside that are like making sure like no one's getting in as not supposed to, that everything is protected and taken care of. I've rephrased that a lot, but I just want to make sure that that's clear. They were also supposed to receive and handle tithes. And this seems to be for a few purposes, both for tithes that are offered to God and also tithes that are meant to support the priest work. It's very interesting to me that you have like all of these privileges that are given to the priest as well, and to the Levites in general. The priests especially have like these garments that they wear, and they're complicated garments to make, right? You have a situation like that, but this was supposed to help the Levites in a way, while nonetheless offering tithes and offerings as something given to God, right? So that's an interesting thing. I want to spend a little bit of time on this. It was the Levites that were in charge of musical worship. A couple of misconceptions. For example, there is absolutely no such thing as congregational singing in the Old Testament. And that might sound crazy, but when you have, for example, in the Psalms, to praise the Lord with the lyre and things like that, there's no reason to assume that these principles given in the Pentateuch, talking about what the Levites were supposed to do, and that they were supposed to be the ones doing that. And especially, I have on here points from 1st and 2nd Chronicles, because if you read those carefully, only the Levites were supposed to be doing this. Now, this doesn't mean that you don't have worshipful acts that are done by individuals, at other points in the Old Law, but you do not have congregational singing in the Old Law. You just don't. This is kind of related even to like, how do we look at a book like Psalms, right? You only have really like 14 of the Psalms that claim for themselves to have been performed by the Levites. And so if that internal evidence is already kind of shaky, then I think the whole claim that the Psalms were used as as Israel's hymnal, it's kind of flawed, because you just don't have evidence for that. We can postulate and extrapolate all we want, but if there's no evidence, then do we really have a right to come to that conclusion? The Levites were the ones that were in charge of performing musical worship to God. And this is also important because of some things we'll talk about later on. We're going to go through each of like sort of the 5 acts of worship that are given in the New Testament, and we're going to spend time on singing within that. It is a very interesting thing that, it's kind of assumed that, all of the Levites, or all the Israelites, they all had these instruments and they had all these things that they were worshiping God with. And it's just kind of assumed that all the Israelites were doing this. Not true. You only get a sense in the Old Law that it is the that it is the Levites specifically that are doing this. And, in a way, I mean, you even have like mention of like the skilled singers, for example. The common term for wisdom is often just used in referring to skill, right? And those individuals who sang and were skillful at doing so, they would do this, and basically the Israelites would take part, but not through musical worship. This is just one of those things we need to pay attention to, because misassuming about this leads to misassumptions about New Testament worship as well. For instance, that New Testament worship is derived from Jewish worship. There's just not there's no reason to assume that the New Covenant's worship is based entirely on the Old Covenant, or even that it's necessarily related. These are different principles that are given. So that's an important thing to bear in mind too. That musical worship was specifically and only tasked to the Levites. Any questions on this? Okay. So with the last few minutes that we have, we want to just spend some time talking about some takeaways of this study, because it can kind of seem just very unrelated to everything else that we're studying, of like, why does it matter what the Levites did? Well, there were a few reasons for that, and if we understand these, we understand a lot more about how worship in the Old Testament was supposed to take place. First of all, every Israelite was expected to be faithful to God and was commanded to be faithful to God, but the Levites' duties and privileges were specific. So that's why when Jesus is giving the parable of the Good Samaritan, you have a Levite that's mentioned there, because this is part of the priestly tribe, right? And so that's supposed to be a big deal to signal to us as readers. Oh wow, the priest didn't help this individual that had been beaten and left on the side of the road. That wasn't something that the Levite did in that situation. We're trying to strike this balance here, of course, between saying that all the Israelites, were distinct from the Levites, and yet they all had a similar responsibility. I emphasize this because you couldn't have, Levites that are being holy and doing all this stuff, and then the Israelites that are doing no such thing and just living whatever way they want because, they're not Levites, so it's okay. God gives punishment to all Israelites, carrying them off to Babylon and doing things like this to all of them, not just the Levites. There are expectations that are given upon every single one of them, right? But again, what the Levites specifically were supposed to do was very specific. The Levites' promotion and practice of holiness made their jobs very serious. I want to just take a little bit of time in the Nadab and Abihu story in Leviticus 10. And just to sort of emphasize some different things, really. So if you go to Leviticus 10, we'll just read the first 3 verses here. Now Nadab and Abihu, the sons of Aaron, each took his censer and put fire in it and laid incense on it and offered unauthorized fire before the Lord, which he had not commanded them. And fire came out from before the Lord and consumed them, and they died before the Lord. Then Moses said to Aaron, "This is what the Lord has said. Among those who are near to me, I will be sanctified, and before all the people, I will be glorified." And Aaron held his peace. So, paying careful attention to this, again, right? This is talking about an unauthorized fire is how the ESV has it, but really we're talking a lot about just like strange fire, foreign fire, and we really don't know exactly what that means. That's just kind of one of those. It's one of those things that, like, we understand the story in principle that they gave something that they weren't supposed to give, but exactly what was wrong with the fire is more of a lexical issue that you can't really solve, right? So that's just something to bear in mind. But I want to pay special attention to verse 3 here, right? So you can imagine Aaron is probably pretty distraught because remember, Nadab and Abihu are sons of Aaron, right? Maybe we don't pay enough attention to this, but Aaron is probably pretty torn up about this. When it says that Aaron held his peace, that's kind of an indication in some way, even though this might have been really hard for him. But Moses says to Aaron there, and he speaks for the Lord here, that among those who are near me, I will be sanctified, and before all the people, I will be glorified. So, does those who are near me, refer specifically to the Levites? Maybe. But generally speaking, what this is just saying is that all of those who approach God with worshipful acts are supposed to do so in a way that is, they're supposed to do so in a way that is pleasing to Him, right? You don't really have the idea in the Old Testament that, that they could just approach however they wanted. Something to emphasize just again, because that's a misconception that sometimes can happen. And when you look in verse 8 in this chapter as well, the reason that I mentioned, that they were likely drunk and that was probably the cause of all of this, otherwise you have this question of like, why exactly command drink no wine or strong drink in this context? There was probably a connection there, that not only did they offer something that wasn't good before the Lord, but also that they did not approach Him with the right in the right condition. That's something to pay attention to as well. So in verse 8 it says, "And the Lord spoke to Aaron, saying, Drink no wine or strong drink, you or your sons with you, when you go into the tent of meeting, lest you die. It shall be a statute forever throughout your generations. You are to distinguish between the holy and the common, and between the unclean and the clean. And you are to teach the people of Israel all the statutes that the Lord has spoken to them by Moses." So maybe verse 10 provides some extra information on what might have been meant by strange or unauthorized fire. That it was a, that in some sense it was something common when it was meant to be holy, or that it was unclean when it was supposed to be clean. But again, we don't exactly know. My point here is only to say that what the Levites' job was not just a, you don't have this very loose contract, when they get started with this work. This is a big commitment. And if you were born as a son of Aaron, you were expected to do this. And stories like this kind of teach that there's some reverence that they were supposed to have in regards to how they approached God. And this is the last thing that we'll talk about here. The New Testament, in several places, but I just put these two. The New Testament calls all Christians priest. It calls all Christians priest. Let's just turn to 1 Peter 2 for a moment. 1 Peter 2, 8 and 9. I just want us to notice this. Just verse 9, not verse 8 as well. And it says there, "But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for His own possession, that you may proclaim the excellencies of Him who called you out of darkness into His marvelous light. Once you were not a people, but now you are God's people. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy." So we are called priest in the New Testament. I do want to caution us, though, right? Because sometimes what happens is, the New Testament calls Christians priest, and the Levitical priesthood were all priest, and so basically whatever the Levitical priest did, we need to either do the exact same things or find parallels and principles in order to be the right kinds of priest. That's not necessarily, something that it's a totally fair principle to take away from this. That the holiness that they were supposed to have, the different roles that they were supposed to play. you see this pop up in the Old Covenant and the New Testament in calling Christians priests. We shouldn't take that as saying like, well, time to put on a holy garment and to offer sacrifices and to officiate the holy feast. I don't think that's the point. I don't think the point is to extrapolate connections that the New Testament doesn't draw. It uses the word priest, and by that it's saying that we are supposed to carry ourselves in that manner, and that's how God views us as saints, as priests. That's really important. But the New Testament just does not go into this major elaboration in trying to find parallels between the two, and so I'm just a little wary of doing the same thing. But that's not really the point that I'm trying to get at here. The point here is that Christ is called our high priest. Christ is called our high priest. We as Christians are priests, but it's Jesus who carried out the sacrifice. It's Jesus who did it. And he doesn't have to offer sacrifices every year. He doesn't have to offer sacrifices for himself. He died once. He died for all. And all of us have the opportunity to be saved by him because of what he did on the cross. The Levitical system simply did not have that same kind of assurance. So as we mentioned earlier concerning the Day of Atonement, the Old Testament could only atone or cover. But with the New Covenant, you do have this full forgiveness that's offered. And that's important. Go to Hebrews 10, if you don't mind. Hebrews 10, 11 through 14. I want us to read this together. Actually, we'll start in verse 10 here. And by that will we have been sanctified through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ once for all. And every priest stands daily at his service, offering repeatedly the same sacrifices which can never take away sins. Pay attention to that. It's scriptural. It says that they cannot take away sins. So, but when Christ had offered for all time a single sacrifice for sins, he sat down at the right hand of God, waiting from that time until his enemies should be made a footstool for his feet. For by a single offering he has perfected for all time those who are being sanctified. So Jesus didn't have to jump in several times. It even says that in Hebrews 9, that when Jesus comes again, he's not going to be for the sake of dealing with sin. It's going to be to judge, because what he already did was effective, right? So just bear all of this in mind. Any questions or comments on this? Okay. Well, we'll end off a couple of minutes early here, but I just want to emphasize to you the reason that we're talking about this is because we're trying to historically analyze how worship has worked from the beginning to what we're supposed to do now as New Testament Christians. And so understanding this about the Levites, and maybe this is a lot of new information for you. It definitely was for me. Some of the things I had to nuance and clarify. But these were the people who were supposed to do a lot of these worshipful duties in the Old Covenant. And so recognizing them for who they are and seeing how Jesus even alludes to them is a very beneficial thing. So next week we'll spend some time talking about how worship seemed to work in Jesus' time and what exactly he has to say about that. So I appreciate your kind attention, and we will see you in worship in a few moments.